We're going to do that. Movie Buff Specialist Phil and John are back as we continue counting down our top 100 movies of all time, and we are officially a third of the way there. I can't believe that has happened. We are a third of the way there. We do this 2 more times, John, and we are done. Tonight, we're on to our number 67s of all time. For me, it's The Exorcist. For John, it's Pulp Fiction, but I have Pulp Fiction way higher. So we're not talking Pulp Fiction tonight. We're talking Sin City instead, which is pretty good replacement there by John. I'm impressed. John, you don't impress me often, but you impressed me this time. No, I that was the first time I've probably watched Sin City since 2006. So that was a fun experience, and it clearly is taking a lot of inspiration from Pulp Fiction in the style in which it tells its story. So good call on picking Pulp Fiction or Sin City here to replace Pulp Fiction. And thanks for making me watch it again, because I should have watched that sooner because I appreciate it a lot more. But something else I want to bring up here is John had never seen The Exorcist. So hi, John. Welcome to the real world.
I know, Phil. It's been one of those ones that's been on my list for a long time. But every time I've ever wanted to watch it, whoever's around me has been like, nah, I saw it when I was a kid and I never want to watch that movie again. Mm-hmm. Then I watched it and I was like, I don't know why you guys don't want to watch this movie again, because this movie's amazing.
Yeah. It's we're not going to lead with that, John, but I agree. And we'll get into The Exorcist in a little bit here, but yeah, it's always funny to me, like always considered to be the scariest movie ever, or whatever anybody wants to say. But at the end of the day, I still don't find it to be all that terrifying. I just find it to be psychologically disturbing as all hell, and that's why I think it holds up. But we'll talk about that one in a little bit. Let's start, though, with Sin City, which isn't actually in either of our top hundreds, but makes it on this list. Has a pretty big cult following from when it came out. I remember for the longest time, and I don't think it's still up there, but for the longest time, this was in like the top 60 or 70 on IMDb's top 200. I don't know if it's still on there, but it was. And I think it's kind of fallen off a little bit, mainly because it's very much the machismo and the, however it treats its female characters who all walk around in like fishnet stockings and gigantic heels. But really incredibly well stylized movie and a lot of fun from what I remember. But John, why did you end up picking this to be the replacement for Pulp Fiction this week?
So I also hadn't watched Sin City in a while. And the main driving force behind me picking this for Pulp Fiction was we kind of had that similar story structure in Sin City and Pulp Fiction. And I think that's one of the most important things about Pulp Fiction is the storytelling technique that Tarantino implements in it. So I really wanted to be able to kind of talk about something similar like that. And Sin City is probably one of the best examples that has a very similar structure to it.
Yeah, the movie that I always go to is Go. For me, Go is like the number one Pulp Fiction ripoff of all time. And it's a great movie, but it is a Pulp Fiction ripoff. It's written by John August, who does the Script Notes podcast and like is an incredible writer, has written plenty of great movies. But Go came out in 1999, and it is essentially Pulp Fiction, but it is so much fun. I would say it's almost like I don't want to say it's more fun than Pulp Fiction, because Pulp Fiction is still a very fun movie. But there's something about Go where it's a little bit more lackadaisical than Pulp Fiction is, which is why it's also not a classic. It tells the story out of order, whereas Sin City doesn't really tell the story out of order. Sin City just tells you different vignettes at different points, but it's still telling you, like, we know that opening, well, I have no freaking clue what the opening is, and sorry I didn't read the graphic novel, so Josh Hartnett's part in this movie is a total waste of my time. But in terms of the Bruce Willis part, we know that it has now progressed, and Marv is still living in that world, just at a later time, because we see Nancy as Jessica Alba now rather than as a little kid. And so we can kind of keep the timeline going. So this movie's not actually told out of order, but it is very much doing that whole, we'll focus on this person, then this person, then this person, then this person, and tell 4 very different stories that are very loosely interconnected.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important things is, like, we have that loose connection. We have those similar moments like we do in Pulp Fiction at the bar, where we see Bruce Willis in both instances seeing the other characters that we're going to be focusing on throughout the film. And it just really helps to demonstrate the city as a whole. And it really goes to show that the idea of Sin City as like this setting is so important to this story that's being told.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately what this movie is. This movie is the main character of this movie is the city, and that's why it's called Sin City, and that's why it tells these 4 different stories that are so loosely interconnected. Because the main character, you could say it's Bruce Willis, you could say it's Marv, you could say whatever you want, but at the end of the day, the city itself is what we are learning the most about. The city itself is what's changing or not changing as it goes through this story. And the other characters are just kind of characters who are a part of it. And I really enjoy watching, and I'm just going to mute you while I talk, because I'm getting a little not feedback, but just like a little like hum noise. I don't know what it is, but it's all good. But anyway, I really like the way that this movie is structured. And what I the most impressive thing about this movie, and about maybe myself in general, is that I haven't seen this since 2005 or 2006. And I quote this movie on a daily basis. I never realized how much I quote this movie on a daily basis, which is crazy because this is literally the second time I've seen this movie in my life. But I took away his weapon, both of them. That is a line that just resonated with me for so long. I remember very vividly Nick Stahl as the Yellow Man. I remember like all of the one-liners that Marv throws around. There's so many of them that as I was watching this movie, I'm like, I say that a lot. Or like, I'll like jokingly say that, like when there's like a noir conversation or something, I'll just throw that in as a quote from a noir and not realize I'm quoting Sin City. And I think that's really impressive. I remember at the time thinking this movie was overrated because it kind of had too much of that cult following type thing going on. Kind of like what The Dark Knight eventually built up too much of, which is like, this is the best movie ever. And it's like, it's not the best movie ever. It's a great movie, but it's not the best movie ever. And after rewatching this, I was like, man, I kind of like that this has fallen out of like the social zeitgeist or whatever you want to call it, because now I can just sit back and appreciate this movie for what it is. And it's a very well made, chaotic little whatever.
Yeah, and it's such a movie kind of in this like genre of itself, where it's definitely a noir, but it's so heavily a comic book movie at the same time. Like it has like those kind of like those Dick Tracy vibes and the what was that bad movie in the mid 2000s? The Spirit, like those type of vibes. And I mean, The Spirit came off the heels of Sin City, and they were kind of trying to capture that fire and run with it. But it's so stylistic. That's what's so important about this movie, and I think why it sticks with people so much when they do see it, and perhaps why it doesn't get revisited as often by people, is because it is so stylistically unique the way it's presented, that whenever you see something that's in a similar style now, you compare it to Sin City. And I think that's just such an important thing to be looking at, especially when it comes to like the black and white sequences with like the splash of color and everything like that. That's really utilized incredibly well in this film. This film's all style, but still has the substance underneath it as well.
Well, and it's leaning very hard into this neo-noir stuff. And the Marv section to me is the one section that goes on for too long, because it's just the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over. And I get it. Like, I get it. He's going to get everybody. He's going to beat them all up and all that. But it's leaning into this, like, the dialogue is so over the top, the way they talk about everybody. And it's one of those that now you might say it feels dated, but in 2005, it was also dated, but it knows it's dated. And that's the style of the movie. It's different if you watch a 1946 gangster movie and they say things like this. Then it actually is dated. This is leaning in very, very hard to that style to portray this city as this one-note, like, mock town. This just BS type town. So, it just, I don't know. It just works. And I like watching it this time, I like what Rodriguez did with this movie. I like the adaptation, although I've never read Sin City. I like the performances. It just clicks. And it's something like you said. Then we start getting the movies like The Spirit and whatever other nonsense, and they just don't click. And this movie's not as influential as Pulp Fiction, but Pulp Fiction has a very similar thing where it does what it does. Every movie that came after that wanted to be Pulp Fiction, and there's never been another Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of, obviously, I mean, Tarantino guest directs on this film, so there's that influence there as well. And obviously, Tarantino and Rodriguez are very close friends and work together quite frequently. But I think throwing in Frank Miller into the direction, like as a director as well, and actually having the author of this original graphic novel who understands these characters, helped write all the dialogue. So you have the combination of this original dialogue there combined with like the more like film sensibility attached to it as well. And what it did was that even though it's a comic book movie, and again, this is 2005, like,
yeah,
this was when comic book movies were kind of starting to break into the mainstream, but it was
Batman
just
Begins came out this year.
Yeah. So this was like the moment. Like our comic book movies at this point were like the 99 X-Men and the first couple of Spider-Man movies. And to have this grittier comic book movie that of a highly revered comic be made and presented in this way in the mainstream where it does have a lot of attention, it has big names attached to it. The cast for this movie's incredible.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you have Rodriguez and Tarantino there. They're well-recognized names at this point. And it leans into both the noir and comic book aspects of things because we get that cheesy, as the word completely goes out of my head, the cheesy voiceovers.
Yes. Every single character gets their own. All the men get their own voiceover,
and it's so cheesy. It's like this. I think there's this collective consciousness within society that believes that's how noirs worked, where there is this cheesy voiceover, and I think that's kind of like a Dick Tracy holdover, kind of. Where I mean, if you watch noirs, we don't get that type of voiceover in most noir movies.
One of the ones that we do get it in is actually in my list, which is Double Indemnity. That's one where you do get Fred McMurray is talking to the microphone the entire time, and he says things like, "Hey, baby, you know I couldn't have done it." Like he talks like that. But in this movie, it really works because it could have went the complete opposite way if they didn't lean in as hard as they leaned in. If they only went 75% on this, it doesn't work.
Well, and that's the thing is like this voiceover then really makes it clear this is a comic that was written. And while you're listening to these voiceovers, it's kind of like flipping through the panels of a comic book.
Well, and I almost got the vibe too while I was watching this. It kind of reminded me of the early 2000 video games as well. And early 2000 video games very much were like set in these dark worlds. I mean, even games that were being made by like Naughty Dog or Insomniac games like Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, like those platformer type games were still being made with a darkness to them. They might start off light, but then they get dark. And when they get dark, they have this very foreboding soundtrack, foreboding for a video game in the early 2000s. But you also had the Max Payne video games, and you had all of these video games that were coming out at the time they would get darker as they went, and as they got darker, they would get this soundtrack and go. And the soundtrack in this movie almost reminds me of Rampage when they're traveling like in between cut scenes or whatever it is. But all I'm saying is, so now you have all of these different aspects, and it's like they were almost making a movie that was meant to be a video game, that was meant to be and they're leaning into all of those things as hard as they possibly can. And this was a time where like the PS2 had just come out a few years before this, and video games were starting to be very, very graphic and artistic. And like you had the Metal Gear Solids and the Final Fantasy games where now all of a sudden the people talked and their mouths moved. Like what the hell was going on? You could do so much more with it. And it's like they captured that timing and said, what do teenage boys love right now? They love women who are wearing fishnets. They love comic books, and they love gritty video games. And they took it and they made it one thing, and it was the Sin City movie.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when this movie came out, there was a lot of hype around it from people our age.
Yeah.
I mean, we were, what, 12 when this movie came out?
13? I was 13, yeah.
And, like, obviously this movie's not made for people of that age, but that was the crowd that definitely kind of gravitated towards it. A little bit older than that, but that was, you could tell it was kind of like the target audience they were going for there.
Yeah.
And you're right, they did lean into those tropes of popular culture at the time in order to attract that audience, which is very difficult for a movie that's rated as highly as Sin City is.
Yeah. And it's funny because I appreciate it so much more now. Like, I sit down and watch it now and I just laugh because I do think about when I watched it the first time at 14 or 15, whatever I was, and I'm sitting there watching it, and whatever I was thinking at the time, which I really didn't like this movie that much the first time I watched it. But it's funny to watch it now and just kind of laugh at like the 14 and 15-year-old versions of all the 29 and 30-year-olds right now who who were watching that being like, that was the coolest shit ever. And like knowing that Rodriguez wasn't trying to make the coolest shit ever. He was mocking the coolest shit. Like there is a lot of mocking that goes on in this. And that elevates it though. And that knowing that you're making a movie that at the end of the day does have its place in culture, but at the same time isn't meant to be, whatever, go all the way. Like, I don't know, give me a good movie that's not meant to be whatever, but it's not trying to be the English Patient. You know what I mean? It's not like, look at me, I'm going to make an Oscar-winning movie. It's like, look at me, I'm going to make a movie that's going to be really entertaining, going to be culturally significant, but it's not going to win Best Picture or anything like that. And a lot of old people are going to roll their eyes at it.
Yeah, but I think there's still that group of people who, I think if you watch this as someone who appreciates noir films as well, like you still have that group that's still going to enjoy that. I think that is part of the reason why it feels so much more fulfilling watching it now, is you have that more appreciation for the style that's going into this than we would as 14, 15-year-olds, right? Where we understand the references to like the noir films. We get that aspect of it. We get the fact that these shots that they capture in this film, they are comic book panels.
Yeah.
If you look at the shots in this film, they're almost all, the camera's kind of like has this wide view of everything, and it's like very much just one panel at a time, and it transitions through it. And that again helps capture the style of it and really goes to show what this movie's trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So now let me ask you from a storytelling standpoint. So I like the way Bruce Willis bookends the main stories. I do like the Marv story, although like I think it just goes on too long. The Clive Owen one fascinates me, but it's too short. So that's where like the pacing is weird. The Clive Owen one is way too short. Marv one is way too long. Give me 10 minutes of Marv and make it 10 minutes of Clive Owen, and we have a perfect movie. But what in the world is going on with this Josh Hartnett stuff that bookends it? Because I didn't get it back then, and I really don't get it now.
I also don't get it. I honestly think I need to just read Sin City at some point to understand this. If anyone knows, please let us know. Yeah. DM us and tell us, hey, this is what's going on with Josh Hartnett's character. Because I'd really like to know, because I am fascinated by it. Because it's chosen to bookend the entire film. And I need to do the investigation to figure out why that is. Because this is Josh Hartnett in 2005, too. Josh Hartnett was a big deal in 2005. Yeah. So there's a reason this is here. And eventually I'm going to have to figure out what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end they're signaling that he's going to kill her and, whatever. He's been hired to kill her in the hospital. But to me, it's so out of place with the rest of the movie. Like, what does this opening mean? To me, this opening, it means absolutely nothing. And that frustrates me because I really like everything else. But I complain about this with Star Wars. I complain about this with superhero movies. I complain about this with everything. If I need to read extra material, if I need to watch something that's not this movie, the director and the writer didn't do their job. Because at the end of the day, while the people who love Sin City can sit there and be like, no, like that's the most important character, blah, blah, blah. When you're making a movie, when you're making a TV show, when you're doing anything like that, and you're adapting, which we'll talk about The Exorcist in a second, because it's an adaptation, you have to give the audience everything they need in that 2 hour or 10 hour or whatever hour span, so that if they digest just that one portion, that one piece of whatever the bigger world is, if I just digest The Empire Strikes Back, I can still know that's a great movie without having to watch anything else. They didn't do that here. And it's not that it's a sequel. It's not that it's the end of a trilogy and I just didn't get it. And it's not that it's when we get to Evangelion or whatever, however, Evangelion, when we get to that, and they purposely made that as like, this is the movie that is based on that. Like, this isn't saying that. This is saying Sin City is its own thing. It's an adaptation. Now make the best movie you can make. And you left us in the dark on what's bookending your movie. And it sucks because the Bruce Willis parts are so great, but the opening does nothing for me and the end does nothing for me.
And I think part of that comes down to the fact that we flush out the characters in this film a lot. Like Marv's flushed out a lot. Clive Owen's characters flushed out a lot. Bruce Willis's characters flushed out a lot. Jessica Alba's characters flushed out a lot. But Josh Hartnett's kind of there, and it doesn't seem to fit the way every other character in this film has been portrayed leading up to this point. And that's why his appearance back at the end, you finally see him at the end, and you're like, oh, right, this happened at the beginning of this movie. And then you're like, oh, but what's happening? And that, I think, is really what's preventing this movie from being an all-time great film.
I agree. I think that... Yeah, go ahead.
Both of us gave it 3.5 stars this week. And if either the Josh Hartnett stuff wasn't there or better explained, it likely pushes up to a 4-star film.
I do agree, because I would have forgiven the Marv and Clive Owen stuff a little bit more. But because the Josh Hartnett stuff does nothing for me, and the Marv stuff goes on too long, and the Clive Owen stuff is too short, now all of a sudden I'm like, well, there's a pacing issue. There's an actual pacing issue here, which is a shame, because I mean the strong moments of this, the Benicio del Toro moment in this, the Clive Owen in the room scene is so amazing. Like, there are so many great scenes in this movie, but you can't bookend your movie with something like this. You can't do it. I mean, think about how Pulp Fiction movie we are replacing Sin City with this week has arguably the greatest bookends in film history. Because it's the diner. It's the diner at the beginning and it's the diner at the end. It's arguably the greatest bookend in film history. That's how you bookend it. You make that matter. Sin City doesn't make the Josh Hartnett stuff matter.
No, and part of it also, it doesn't benefit from the fact that the Josh Hartnett stuff at the end is with Alexis Bledel's character rather than a character we've just spent this last chunk of the movie with. Yeah. Yep. Right? Because it kind of feels like, I really enjoy the fact, I like the order that they present these ones in. I like the fact that we have the Marv, or the beginning of the Bruce Willis story, then we have the Marv story, the Clive Owen story, and then we get back to the Bruce Willis story. But then Alexis Bledel is only in that middle section. So how is this relating to what we just watched for the last 45 minutes before the end of the movie?
And it doesn't. And all it is I think it's Josh Hartnett's going to kill her because she betrayed whoever, like her group and all of that. And she left that part and called her mom. And I think that's what's happening. And that's fine. But I don't find, Josh Hartnett's so mysterious. I don't get that. Yeah. I get this is annoying. This is vague. There's a difference between mysterious and vague. That's vague. And to be purposely vague when you're trying to make it seem monumental in this movie, it just doesn't work at all.
I agree. Let's dive into these individual sections a little bit here.
Okay.
The Marv section. You said you feel it's a little too long.
Yes.
Is that because there's this period after his confrontation with Elijah Wood's character?
Yes. Yes. To me, it feels like it should have been the Elijah Wood character's segment. And then it should have, they should have brought in how that tied it, and then he gets killed. Like that, to me, it just goes on, and I'm like, okay, I've watched him beat the crap out of people and just dismember somebody.
Yeah.
Now, like, let's go. Like, let's move. Let's get going. And I just think that it has an epilogue to a 3-act structure, and I don't know why it would be the epilogue.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think part of that comes down to the themes of Sin City. The whole point is, in my opinion, the whole point of this film is that the city is such a terrible place that it makes everyone within it terrible. And the people we're following are the best of the terrible people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it progressively gets better and better the further we go through. Whereas we have Marv, who is doing a very personal thing where he is enraged by the fact that the one girl who gave him attention with his ugly face and everything gets murdered with him right there. He's mad. He wants revenge. But he's doing it because Blondie was a good person.
Yeah, yeah.
And like, we see the righteousness in his actions. And then we move on to Clive Owen's character, who, you know, originally sticking up for Brittany Murphy and then is doing something that's incredibly dangerous to help all the women of that district, right? And then we get to Bruce Willis's character again, who is a cop and who is clearly the straight cop amongst a bunch of dirty cops.
And who's willing to sacrifice his entire honor to save Nancy.
Yeah, right. He is the righteous character, and we've seen this slow progression up it to what sacrifices these righteous characters are willing to make in order to save the people around them, or even save themselves in this end. And like, Marv is willing to become the monster, and Clive Owen's willing to risk himself for this greater good, and Bruce Willis kills himself to save Nancy.
Yep. Old man dies so young girl can live. Fair trade.
Yeah.
That's another one I literally like. I will say old man dies, young girl lives. Like that. I will say like a variation of that all the time. All the time.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, the Marv segment is long because it seems to get to a climax where he's fighting Elijah Wood. And fun fact, Mickey Rourke and Elijah Wood didn't meet until after this movie was finished.
Oh, I believe it. I mean, you never actually see them on screen together.
No, because again, we go back to like the screen, the way they're shooting this film, the way everything's shot, half the actors never have to be on screen with each other.
No. It's a lot of solo stuff. Really, the women are the only ones who had to be on screen with anybody.
Yeah.
Jessica Alba had to be on with Bruce Willis, and Brittany Murphy had to be on with Clive Owen. I mean, that's really it.
Yeah. And I mean, that is kind of the downside of it because these are very strong female characters. Especially like Rosario Dawson's character.
Yeah.
Is an incredibly strong woman. And unfortunately, the film focuses so much on the men, despite the fact that these strong female characters are there. But I get it because it's based on the comic book and everything.
Yes,
so like, we can't chastise them for it.
Well, and what I was going to say is it's also leaning into that trope of badass men who have to save the women who could save themselves and they wear really skimpy clothing. Like, it's leaning into that trope hardcore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why I don't knock this movie for it, because it knows it's doing it. That's a big thing throughout movie history. Does it know it's doing it? And is it doing what, like, is it properly, like satirizing whatever it's properly trying to satirize? And it does. This movie does, by all of by getting that tone and world and all that, it's doing it the right way. If you tell this story from the point of view of the women, it doesn't work, because that's not what this genre is, and that's not what this movie is stating about this genre.
Yeah, exactly. And despite the fact that the women aren't the focal point of any of these stories, they're still some of the best characters in this movie.
Oh yeah,
by a long shot. They're absolutely phenomenal characters, and seeing all the women just, do their thing when they have to kill the gang and everything. It's fascinating to see how strong these women are presented in this film, and 2005, when women weren't really presented this way in comic book movies at all.
No, I mean, it was really just Mary. Well, like you said, it was really just Mary Jane Watson up until this point.
Mm-hmm.
That was really all, and all the X-Men movies, which I guess Halle Berry was doing some cool stuff at that point.
Yeah, like Catwoman.
Like Catwoman, yes. Which also we'll be talking about next week. It's John's number 66, so don't worry.
Absolutely.
Anything else you want to say about Sin City, or should we move on?
No, let's move on.
All right. What was the best movie you watched this week?
The best movie I watched Cloverfield for the first time in quite a few years, and that is easily the second best found footage movie ever made.
Yeah, that's another one, since we're talking about genre like we just did with Sin City. Cloverfield is another one that knows exactly the genre it's leaning into. It goes for it, and it doesn't stop. And there's some great scenes in Cloverfield. And I love the ending where you see the thing fall out of the sky behind them if you look really, really closely. It's great. It's great. I watched that movie. First time I saw that movie, we got to the movie theater so late. It was the opening night on a Friday night. It was me and two of my friends. We went to the movie theater, and we had to sit in the second row in the section where you're looking like this. I don't know how I didn't vomit, but I will never sit in the second row of a movie again. But that was a movie where I was like, I am literally in New York City right now. Like, I am running around New York City.
Yeah, and I definitely vomited the first time I saw this movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I should have. I don't know how I did.
We seem to have lost Phil here. But, yeah, and that's what... Oh, no, you're back. Okay, cool. Okay. Maybe I got lost.
Maybe it was you. We lost John. That's what we lost.
But, no, I definitely vomited after the first time I saw this movie in theaters, because it was it's a very immersive experience, I think is the best way to put it. But
it nails the found footage.
Yeah, and like merging a kaiju movie with the found footage genre, which is really something we hadn't seen at this point. Found footage had been very much relegated to like pure horror movies at this point. But this is definitely one of the best found footage movies, in my opinion, second only to the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, I'd have to really think about it, but I don't think I'm too off with you on that. It has it's not it doesn't lack purpose to why it's found footage. You know, a lot of these movies, they lack purpose to why they have to be found footage, and they can't just be a regular movie, and a lot of that is just because it's cheaper. But this movie really nails the found footage genre, and it's the better District 9. Really, Cloverfield is the better District 9, and I probably should have picked Cloverfield for my movie, but I haven't seen it in a very long time too. And District 9 I don't own Cloverfield, so I wouldn't have to pay to rent it. So for me, the best one I watched this week, I finally rewatched The Illusionist for the first time in like 6 or 7 years. I love that movie. I know so many people don't like that movie. I know that people want to say The Prestige is better. I know that like that's a big argument. The Prestige is a steaming pile of shit, and I have no problem saying that. If you don't think about The Prestige, it's a great movie. The second you actually start to think about the motivations and the actions taking place in that movie, it makes no sense. The Illusionist, it might not make sense in terms of where the magic is coming from, but everything else in this movie is perfect. And I love how small this story is. It is such a small story, and yet it just packs a punch the entire time. It's a period piece. It's slow, but it's got so many cool moments. The acting is phenomenal. I love Paul Giamatti. He should have been nominated for an Oscar. Honestly, and I am a massive Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine fan. If they weren't going to nominate Steve Carell for Little Miss Sunshine, Paul Giamatti should have won the Oscar for The Illusionist that year. Like, it is just, he was so good in this. He carries the movie. Ed Norton, Mr. Mysterious, is really good. Jessica Biel can act. I mean, you wouldn't know it if you watched the rest of her movies, but in that one, she sure is good. And Rufus Sewell just plays a great villain. It also packs like one of my favorite twists ever. I love the end of this movie. It's all set up the entire time. It doesn't pull the carpet out from under you, because if you've been paying attention, you knew it was coming the whole time. And I love it. I think it's one of the best hidden gems of the 2000s. At one point in my life, before I had seen, close to probably 10,000 movies, this was probably in my top 100. And now it's just gotten to the point where I've seen so much from like world cinema and all that it definitely falters a little bit. But it's a 4-star movie. I love watching it. This is a movie I could sit down and just watch all the time. Like, this is a great popcorn flick that's not really a popcorn flick, and I love it all.
Yeah, I haven't watched that movie in quite a few years, but I definitely need to get around to it again. Because I do remember thoroughly enjoying it when I did last watch it.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're gonna sit there and tell me The Prestige is better, I will sit here and nitpick The Prestige until you die because I hate The Prestige. I think that is a nonsense
Oh,
movie.
I was always more of an Illusionist fan. It's okay.
Good. No, no, no. I'm not saying you. I'm saying you is like the proverbial you. But everybody loves The Prestige and then talks about how crappy The Illusionist is. It's like, stop being a Christopher Nolan fanboy and admit that probably about 4/10 of his movies, I don't want to say half, just under half his movies aren't very good. Because he keeps making bad movies all of a sudden. But anyway, Tenet is poop. Anyway, let's move on to my number 67, which doesn't feature poop, but it sure does feature vomit. And we are talking about The Exorcist, the 1973 movie by William Friedkin that totally ruined people's lives when it came out. And Reagan McNeil pretty much ruined every parent's life and every child's life. And anybody who watched this was terrified. I always find, this was a movie that when I was growing up, my dad always said it was the scariest movie of all time, scariest movie of all time, scariest movie of all time. I don't find this movie scary. I find this movie psychologically devastating, though. And that's where it differs for me. Her spinning her head around, her vomiting, her doing whatever with a crucifix, that doesn't scare me. But the idea that it could just happen to anyone, it's all random, you don't know. And last week I also watched The Usual Suspects, which is in my top 100, so I'm not going to mention that as my favorite movie of the week. But I watched The Usual Suspects, and in that movie, Kaiser Soze, there's that whole thing of, the devil, and, I believe in God, and the only thing I fear is Kaiser Soze. But it's that thing where you might not necessarily believe in God or the devil or, where your beliefs are at. But this is a movie that'll still hit you. It doesn't matter really where you are at in your religious beliefs. It'll still hit you. Father Carys' storyline is amazing. I love his storyline, how he loses faith and how that starts to impact him. Ellen Bernstein's great. It's just from top to bottom, it's just a great movie. William Friedkin's direction is some of the best of all time in this movie. And the most impressive thing is that in 1973, when this came out, this was the highest grossing movie of all time. Not adjusted for inflation, not because of some, not in terms of like highest profitable movie like Blair Witch ended up doing later. This was the highest grossing movie of all time when it came out in 1973, which is unbelievable to think about because that's not what horror movies make a crap ton of money. But they're not ever making 500 million, 400. Right now, The Exorcist box office gross is $440 million since it came out. That's insane. Like, that's for a movie that is just, it's 50 years old now. But, and it's not this Gone with the Wind, anybody can sit down. There's a lot of people who will not watch this movie. And it has made that much money. And unfortunately, it's also made a bunch of crappy sequels. But anyway, John, what did you get from this your first time watching it?
This movie was not what I was expecting at all. Based on all the stories I've heard of The Exorcist over the years, based on my mother telling me she can't watch it when she started watching it at the age of 14, based on my roommate telling me he couldn't finish watching it at the age of 14. And to watch this movie and see that, like, none of the real intense demonic stuff starts happening until you're well over halfway into this movie. It falls back onto what we were talking about last week with Jaws and just how the patience is so necessary for this type of film. But it's absolutely incredible. It has, like you said, it does kind of, it's not scary. It's not leaving you. For some people, the image of Reagan going down the stairs is kind of terrifying, right? But
so you watched the director's cut?
Oh, did I?
Did you watch the Spider Walk? Is that what you're talking about?
I did say that, yeah.
Yeah. No, you watched the director's cut then.
I didn't know.
Yeah, you watched the director's cut.
Oh, okay. Is that not in the theatrical cut?
That is not in the theatrical version. That is a cut scene that was added for the director's cut.
Interesting.
Yeah, the Spider Walk. Yeah. That's not actually in the movie. But
good to know.
Yeah.
But like there are some visuals that are kind of scary, right? But overall, like this isn't the type of movie that's going to really give you nightmares from visuals and things like that. I think like the scariest aspect of this movie is like the failure of science to help in this movie. And like I was so impressed with the treatment of mental health in this film, with the treatment of like medical procedure and everything in this film, because it really did show people working to try to find a solution, and going to a priest and getting an exorcist was really a last resort thing.
Mm-hmm. That's the best part about this movie. So, okay. So every movie that has followed this, it's we need an exorcist, we need a priest, we need somebody, we need whatever. Every movie that has followed this, and they just get there. I mean, even The Conjuring, they'll make fun of it, and then they do it like it's coming the whole time.
Yeah.
This movie is called The Exorcist, and she doesn't actually mention an exorcism, or an exorcism isn't mentioned to her until about an hour and 10 minutes into the movie. That's the first time. And she goes and she's talking to Father Carys, and she is saying to him everything else but the word exorcism, because she knows he's going to laugh her out. She won't even show her eyes where she just got beat up by her daughter, who is clearly something's going on here. And his reaction and her reaction, everything like that. And the fact that even then it's not, we don't believe you. It's we don't trust that this is actually what you need. You don't know what you're saying. This movie is a victim of its own success a lot of the time. Because when something is called the scariest or the funniest or the saddest, if you don't cry, if you don't laugh, if you don't crap, you're not helping people here. You know what I mean? Like, it's true though. If you don't scream at the top of your lungs watching a movie, it's not the scariest movie of all time. But the difference is what people are scared of nowadays as compared to back in the 70s. And the truth of the matter is, our age range, our what, I can't think of what it's
generation.
Called. Generation. Thank you. I had to look at my millennials versus Gen X buff. Our generation is more scared of like the pop, the loud noise, like, because you don't think about that. It just happens and you jump and that's it. And then you can go look at your phone or something until the next loud noise that makes you jump, whether you're paying attention or not. Back then, it was very much like you watch this, you thought about it, you talked to everybody about it, and that was it. And then you laid in your bed at night and you couldn't text your friends and say, did you see this movie? Because it's freaking me out right now. You couldn't look up online how realistic an exorcism was back then. You couldn't figure that stuff out. So this movie was devastating for a lot of people back in the 70s. Now it hurts it because when people say, oh, it's the scariest movie of all time, you sit down and watch it and you're not the most scared you've ever been. You say, oh, that was disappointing. Unless you see it for what everything else it does and what it achieves. And the direction and the special effects in this movie are literally, other than Space Odyssey, probably the greatest of all time. Other than Space Odyssey, I would honestly say these are probably the greatest special effects, the greatest makeup, everything. She levitates. How are they doing that in 1973? The bed shaking. The thing sliding across the room. Her body flopping back and forth, which, by the way, she is being yanked by either an assistant director or somebody like that back and forth. That's not her just flopping her body. All of those things, the head spinning around. There are so many moments like that you literally sit there and go, how did they do this in 1973? And if you can really appreciate what this movie achieved, there's very few. I think I might have one or two horror movies above it, but it's hard to argue with people that it's not the best horror movie of all time when you look at all of the techniques and everything else going around it, on top of the story, on top of the psychological despair, and on top of everything that all of these characters are going through. It doesn't just focus on Reagan and her mother. It focuses on Carys and Marin and drunk director Brett and Father Dyer and Lee J. Cobb, who plays a phenomenal small role in this movie. It focuses on all of them. And that's what's so unbelievably impressive about this movie.
Yeah, it's almost hard to realize when you watch this movie now that it's 50 years old, and you just watch to see the way it's approached, because it's not approached as a horror movie, it feels like. It feels like it's approached in a way that even something like an epic would be approached as, right? Where it's focuses so much on character development throughout the entire thing. And it's called The Exorcist, and the exorcism doesn't start until there's like half an hour left of this movie.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
we spend that entire first hour just learning about all of the characters, learning about Father Carys and everything he's going through, learning that he is a man of science and he has studied psychology and everything, but still decided to turn to the cloth and become a... See, now I'm quoting Sin City out of nowhere.
I know. Way to go, man. Way to go.
But he decided to dedicate himself to the church and everything and be a psychologist through the church. And it's just so fascinating because you see his character development in a way where he's definitely losing his faith in religion at that point. Mm-hmm. And especially after like the death of his mother and everything. And it's so fascinating having a horror movie delve into the characters like this, because that is what makes a horror movie good.
Yeah.
These horror movies that we had over the last, like not over the last little while, because we've kind of gone back to this type of style,
mm-hmm.
but for that decade, at the early aughts and everything, we had shelves of characters, we had archetypes, and that was about it.
Yeah.
But when we actually invested in the characters in a horror movie, it makes the movie scarier because you feel invested in them and you feel like, oh my God, I can't believe this is actually happening to them.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, that's why you feel for Regan, because they set her up so well as just a normal girl. She's just a normal little girl. What'd you do today? Oh, I did this and blah, blah, blah. And she's just living with her mother and it's her birthday. And what are you going to do for your birthday? You're going to die up there. That's what you're going to do. She looks at the astronaut dead in the eye and says, you're going to die up there, and then pees all over the floor. But so I've studied this movie like crazy, and like I legitimately have studied this. This was one of my dad's like top 5 movies of all time, and he would sit there and watch the making of and all this stuff. And what I think is unbelievable about this movie is the level of thought that Friedkin put into this. The line, there's nothing scary in the movie, although I do find the parts in northern Iraq to be quite disturbing. But there's nothing feels off in Georgetown until Father Carys sits there, looks the priest in the eye and says, I think I'm losing my faith. From then on, there's not an upbeat moment in the entire movie. It's all downhill from there because it's Carys losing his faith. And you see almost like the devil has now brought himself in. And now he's going to take this man down one by one because now he can get to Regan because there's nobody to protect him. Mm-hmm. And all of that, the way that people walk up and down stairs in this movie is purposeful. Whether they're ascending or they're descending into hell. The mom walking up the stairs and him waving to her, trying to get her attention in the dream, and she turns around and walks back down after the devil's face flashes, and she starts walking back down. That is him imagining her descending into hell. Yeah. That is what that is. And so these little things that you don't even think about, you're just like, it's stairs, it's somebody walking. Freaking thought about every single detail in this movie. And it's unbelievable. I mean, it really is, and it shows, because now that you know that, go watch the movie and you're going to pick up on so many of those things throughout. It's impossible not to see. And to see that level of detail put into a horror movie, we don't see that anymore. And even now, like, I love It Follows. It Follows, one of my favorite horror movies of the last, 2 decades, 3 decades. I mean, really, back since early 90s. It's one of my favorite horror movies there. But still, even It Follows, it might not hit the archetypes, but it's still very much, you're still not getting that level of detail. And that's a very detailed movie, but you're not getting that level of detail. It's still leaning into tropes and things like that. This movie was just like, screw it. We're going to make a movie about priests and a little girl and an actress. They got everything. And we're just going to have this demon come in and take over anyway. But it's not a demon. She says she's the devil herself. Like, it's just, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and there, like you were saying, there are so many little things in this movie that if you don't know to pick up on them, you won't pick up on them. Because even like the expedition to northern Iraq, it's never really explained why he was in Iraq or anything. And I mean, a layman watching this movie is just gonna be like, okay, there's just like this archaeological dig going there. But then if you know that Iraq is believed to be like where the Garden of Eden was, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it's the cradle of civilization with Mesopotamia and everything like that. It's just, there's so much built in that area, and a little detail like saying, hey, this is Iraq, just adds that many more layers to the way that this film is presented.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that opening. I mean, that opening with the score and that music and just kind of the noise. It's just noise. Yeah. It's so well done, and I love those parts. Max von Sydow. You want to hear something crazy? Max von Sydow was 44 years old in this movie.
That is crazy.
The guy who plays Father Marin, for all of those who were listening, he is 44 years old in this movie. They make him look like he's 90, and he just died a couple of years ago at like 91. Like, it's crazy. He's 44 years old. Jason Miller, I think, was 6 years younger than him at the time that this movie was being, like, it's insane. But like I love the buildup of this and how Marin knows it's coming, and that realization with the shaking hand and the pill, and like he knows it's coming. So where does he go? He goes to northern New York, almost just to wait, wait, because it's coming. They're gonna be here soon. And sure enough, he gets that call, and he knows exactly. He doesn't even question it, and it leads to, I would probably say, not in terms of scenes, but in terms of shots, other than the ape throwing the bone in the air, and again, I'm going back to Space Odyssey, probably the most, and it probably is more iconic than that at this point. The most iconic shot in film history is it has to be him standing under the lamppost looking up at the light.
Yeah.
It has to be. It's the poster of the movie, of the highest grossing movie up until 1975 when Jaws came out. It's been seen by everybody. It's like that shot is an image of terror. That is a shot of horror. That defines a genre, and it's a man standing underneath a light post with a briefcase in his hand.
Yeah. I mean, it's literally him entering the devil's house, right?
Yeah.
It's just such an iconic shot. And one thing that people don't take advantage of in movies that we won't mention on this podcast are still shots a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this theory in film, right, where you can move, so why don't you move?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like music, right? Where sometimes the most important parts in a piece of music is the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And film needs to take that advantage more, where it's just a still shot. And that's what we have here. And it's so impactful because we're so used to seeing the moving around it.
Mm-hmm. And in a movie of chaos where the room is swirling, those things are flying around, which, by the way, how did they do that? Things are flying around the room. Beds are shaking. People are doing whatever. Like, we have rats in the attic and all of this. Loud noises. It's a very loud movie. The whole part in northern Iraq is so loud. Everything that's taking place at the college is very loud. It's a very loud, and you can't really get your focus. It's irritating almost. And in this moment, it's completely silent. It's just the music and it's the sound of a car pulling up and driving away. And it's horrifying. It's because you have to think about people in 1973. You didn't watch this on DVD. You didn't watch this on VHS. That didn't exist. You had to go see this in a theater. So you're sitting down and you're watching this in a theater with a bunch of other people, and you've never seen anything like this. And all of a sudden you're like, this guy's about to go in and fight the devil.
Yeah.
What more do you need to set the mood for the last 30 minutes of a movie? You don't need anything more. And when he comes in and says, are you ready? And he starts talking to Father Carys and everything, and they start discussing what's going to go on. Unbelievable. It's I just get chills like talking about it because there's just so much good going on there. It's really incredible.
Yeah. It's really hard to put into words exactly what defines this movie as so incredible. But yes, it's all of these things culminated together. And the fact that you have Max von Sydow, who is a phenomenal actor and is in like everything, it turns out, because I've watched multiple movies with him in it this week.
Well, he's in everything that Ingmar Bergman ever made, so that helps.
Yes. And he's phenomenal in this. And from the very beginning, like, you have Marin, and from the beginning sequence in Iraq, you know he knows something bad's coming. But you also see when he's like performing The Exorcist and stuff, you do get that feeling that he knows he's not making it out of there alive.
He doesn't have a choice. This is it.
Yeah.
He's not going to make it out alive, but he doesn't have a choice but to be able to do this to save this woman, like to save this little girl. This is his time. This is what he has to do. And I mean, yeah, he's going into that absolutely knowing that he is going to fail. Like he knows that he's going to fail, but maybe he can weaken it enough. That's all he can try to do.
Yeah. And like you said, like the most terrifying part of this movie is this idea that this could happen to anyone. And the way it's portrayed in the film is just, we're not told why it happens to Reagan.
Yeah. And we never find out. She just doesn't remember.
No. And there's nothing about it. It's like, why did it happen to her? How did this demon Marin found in Iraq end up possessing this 12-year-old girl?
Yep. And that's the scary question.
Yeah.
That is absolutely the scary question. So I just want to jump over. So this movie only won 2 Oscars. It won Best Screenplay based on another material, which makes sense. It had to. William Peter Blatty's screenplay is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
It wins Best Sound, which it also had to. Like, it did not have a choice. Ellen Bernstein lost to Glenda Jackson for a movie that I've never heard of, A Touch of Class. Linda Blair lost to Tatum O'Neal, who's actually phenomenal in Paper Moon, and that might irk people who love The Exorcist, but Tatum O'Neal is amazing. And Jason Miller lost, and I honestly can't remember who Jason Miller lost to, but he lost, and and it doesn't win Best Picture. It lost to The Sting. It lost Best Director to Robert Redford. Like, it lost all this stuff. It just kind of blows my mind, though, rewatching both of these. And I rewatched The Sting maybe about a year ago. The Sting is a very entertaining movie. They're not even in the same class. What went into this movie and what had to be done to make this movie work, it's impossible. It's impossible now. He was setting the temperature in the room at like 20 degrees so that they were really breathing their breath so that was coming out. People were like getting... what's her name? Mercedes McCambridge, who's an Oscar winner for All the King's Men. She does the voice of Reagan when she's possessed. They had her smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day and drinking scotch nonstop so that it would screw up her vocal cords. Yeah. It's so, like, you can't get away with that stuff now, and I'm glad you can't get away with that stuff now. But at the same time, how does William Friedkin not win Best Director that year when all of that's going on? And you know, that's the thing. It's kind of funny. Like, horror movies just don't win, and this was the best chance that horror movies really had to pull it out. But I just wanted to kind of throw in, like, it doesn't really win many Oscars. It doesn't win Best Score. But then again, the score for The Sting is iconic. That's everybody who's ever gotten an ice cream cone from a car knows that score. So, but yeah, that's my quick side note. What do you got?
Yeah, it is kind of weird to look at it now. We kind of talked about like awards and everything. We bring it up every once in a while when we get to a movie that, you know, has a performance or is directed well or it should have won Best Picture or something like that. It's really interesting seeing which movies really end up standing the test of time, because you know what? You can go and ask 100 people, and more of them are going to know The Exorcist than they are going to know The Sting.
Absolutely. I would almost bet that most people don't know what The Sting is. Unless you're a big movie fan or you love Paul Newman, you probably don't know what The Sting is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the interesting thing. And part of that does come down to, when it comes to The Exorcist, it does come down to the cult of horror. Horror is a genre that has been more appreciated in recent years than it has been in the past. And even then, in the past, like with the rebirth in the 90s and everything like that, there are very dedicated people. There are a lot of people I know who don't like movies that aren't horror movies. Like, those people are out there, and that's what the horror genre really brings out, are people who enjoy this type of thing. And that's kind of why they were neglected so much for awards for a long time. So even when you do get a movie of The Exorcist caliber that has incredible performances all around, incredible visual effects, fantastic sound, fantastic score, everything about this movie is fantastic, top to bottom. it still doesn't get the appreciation that it deserves at an awards because of the genre it falls in. Because you did have a bunch of people being like, I'm never watching that movie again.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and that always ends up hurting these types of movies, which is a bummer because that shouldn't be the case, you know? That just absolutely should not be the case. But yeah, I mean, I love this movie. I think that there's so much to dissect with it. I think there's so many things that you could look into. Watch the making of this movie seriously, what they did to these actors. Ellen Bernstein like almost broke her back in this movie. Linda Blair was getting the crap kicked out of her in this movie. They wouldn't even let Linda Blair read the script. They would just tell her what to do, and she didn't even say anything, and then they would just put Mercedes McCambridge's voice in there. And they wouldn't even like Linda Blair had no idea what she was doing because she was so young. They couldn't have her do any of this stuff. And that's what I think that ultimately is what makes this movie the most terrifying and why a lot of exorcism movies don't work beyond this. Watching a hot 20-something girl be possessed by a demon isn't scary. Watching a guy be possessed by a demon isn't scary. Watching a 12-year-old girl be possessed by a demon and turn into a monster is terrifying. Because why?
It's that innocence factor, right?
Yeah.
It's the idea that it's kind of like how the Lord of the Flies works, where it takes like this ideal candidate and takes it out of its element and gives you the opposite to make it more impactful. Because, you know, a 12-year-old girl is supposed to be innocent. That's how we're supposed to view a 12-year-old girl. And like you said, a man being possessed by a demon and having superhuman strength and like being able to throw people out windows and stuff, that's not impressive. A 12-year-old doing that, that's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. Yep. So now I just want to throw out, because we didn't really talk about him, but Lee J. Cobb in this movie, I think he's so good. I love that they even see that's the detail too that a lot of horror movies will miss now, or they'll bring that character in just to die. They'll bring in the detective who goes searching and a demon comes down and kills him. The demon doesn't kill Lee J. Cobb. The demon kills the drunk director by breaking his neck and throwing him down the stairs. And Lee J. Cobb goes and stands outside and says, what the hell's going on? And then watches the girl walk by when she's supposed to be tied down to the bed. Like the use of Kinderman in this movie, that's the detective's name, is so good. Even though he really doesn't actually play a part in the movie, he doesn't really do anything to impact what is going on. That investigation element, and the fact that it's there, and the fact that it is building up the suspense of maybe there's something else going on here, or at least we're grounding it in reality, even as things are starting to delve out of control. I mean, it's a great detail, and to get Lee J. Cobb to play the role, and Lee J. Cobb doing his whole "it's for my daughter" and then saying actually it's for me, like, just he's one of the all-time great actors. Like Lee J. Cobb's just ridiculous. And we talked about him earlier when we talked about 12 Angry Men, so he's just
And I mean, part of that role too, I think also having the lieutenant there really grounds the movie as well. It helps the grounding of it because it does have those obviously those supernatural elements to it. So having that bit of common sense in the film really allows the audience to connect to it more. And again, makes it more terrifying because it does feel more real. Because if we didn't have a police investigation into this murder, it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, we would just be, why is there a murder? Like there was a murder and nobody, it's just assumed it's the demon. But nowadays, that would be the route they'd go, or they'd have a cop come in that we don't get to know at all, that doesn't have any interesting characteristics, who gets killed right away. Kinderman is this dorky guy who is obsessed with pop culture, and like he's a character. He's real. There's so much going on there. It's fun to watch.
Yeah,
it's fun to watch. All right, the last thing I'll say. Most terrifying scene of this movie, to me, at least the most terrifying shot, is the shot where it turns back to the bed and it's Damien's mother sitting there. And she's just sitting there staring at him with her hands down and the lighting and everything. That scene, that's the one part of this movie that actually does make me jolt. Every single time I'm like, oh my God. That part is so disturbing. And the scene where Reagan, after killing Father Merrin, is just sitting there on the edge of the bed with her arms crossed, just watching him. So good. So good.
Absolutely.
That's what I got. That's what I got. If you haven't watched The Exorcist and you just listen to this podcast, you're crazy. Go watch it. If you have watched it, go watch it again. It's about to be spooky season. We got 7 days until Halloween month. So get out there and do this because it's so good.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we're going on to number 66 next week. We're talking Akira from 1988 for John's, and we're going Edward Scissorhands for 1990. A movie with one of the great horror actors of all time in it, even though it's not a horror movie at all. We're sticking with the holiday theme though, because at least Christmas is involved. So
it's still a pretty gothic movie.
Just a little. I mean, just that castle sitting above the town the whole time. I mean, yeah, let's say. But yeah. So Edward Scissorhands from 1990, it's the only one, and Akira from 1988. I'm pretty sure that's the only one too, but I could be wrong.
For now, it's the only one.
For now, exactly. But thank you all for listening. Hope you're enjoying, and we'll be back again next week at some point, maybe after Survivor time, but we'll talk about that and we'll figure it out. But thank you all for listening, and we'll see you with number 66 next week.